My hands wouldn't stop trembling as I held that crisp legal document in my kitchen. The morning sun filtering through the lace curtains David and I had picked out together just 3 years ago. The paper felt heavier than it should have been, weighted down by words that made my stomach twist into knots I didn't know were possible at 62 years old. Catherine Richmond, David's ex-wife from nearly 30 years ago, was claiming she owned his entire $12 million manufacturing business, the company he'd built from nothing but determination and borrowed money in our garage. My coffee had gone cold in its chipped blue mug, the one David always said reminded him of Lake Michigan where we'd honeymooned. But I couldn't bring myself to take another sip because my throat had closed up tight with something between rage and disbelief. The letter from her attorney had arrived on a Tuesday morning, exactly 17 days after I'd buried my husband of 28 years, after I'd watched them lower his casket into frozen February ground, while his 3 daughters from his first marriage stood on the opposite side of the grave without so much as meeting my eyes. I remember the sound of dirt hitting wood, remember how my knees had buckled slightly, and David's younger brother Tom had steadied my elbow with his calloused contractor's hands. Remember thinking how strange it was that I could feel so alone while surrounded by 200 people who'd come to pay respects to a man who'd touched so many lives. But that morning in my kitchen, with Catherine's legal claims spread across my scratched wooden table, I felt a different kind of alone, the kind that comes when you realize someone is trying to erase your entire existence, trying to pretend that the best years of your life never happened at all. David and I had met at a community college night class in 1997, both of us trying to finish degrees we'd abandoned decades earlier for different reasons. He was 43 then, divorced for 5 years, raising 3 teenage girls in a rental house on the west side of town, while running a small machine shop out of a corrugated metal building near the interstate. I was 34, never married, working as an office manager for a dental practice, and wondering if my life would always feel like I was watching it happen to someone else through thick glass. I'd noticed him first because of his hands, the way they moved when he explained mechanical engineering concepts to our struggling classmates, confident and precise, but never condescending, always patient with people who couldn't visualize how gears meshed or why torque mattered. Those hands had held mine 6 months later, when he'd asked me to dinner at an Italian place downtown, had shaken slightly when he'd proposed 2 years after that with his grandmother's simple gold band, had gripped mine fiercely in the hospital when we'd gotten the cancer diagnosis that would eventually take him from me far too soon. Catherine had been his college sweetheart, married at 22 right after graduation, divorced at 38 when their youngest started high school. David never spoke much about those years except to say they'd grown into different people, wanted different things, that the split had been as amicable as such things could be when children were involved and money was tight. She'd gotten the house, he'd kept the business, which was barely profitable then, and they'd shared custody of Emma, Sophie, and Claire, with a kind of rigid schedule that required color-coded calendars and constant negotiation. By the time I entered David's life, Catherine had remarried to a dentist named Robert, had moved to a suburb 40 minutes away, had seemingly built a new existence that didn't require much interaction beyond graduations and occasional holiday coordination. I'd met her exactly 4 times in 28 years, twice at weddings, once at Sophie's college graduation, and once at a funeral for David's mother, where we'd stood in the same church basement eating potato salad from paper plates and making careful small talk about weather and traffic. She'd always been polite to me in that distant way that made it clear I existed in a separate category from real family, that my marriage to David was somehow less legitimate than hers had been, because theirs had produced children, and mine hadn't. I'd accepted this over the years with the kind of resignation that comes from being a second wife, from understanding that stepchildren in their 20s have no obligation to embrace you, from knowing that some battles aren't worth fighting because they only create more distance in relationships already stretched thin. David had tried to bridge those gaps, had invited his daughters to Sunday dinners that they attended sporadically, had paid for their weddings and their graduate school and their first houses with the kind of generosity that came naturally to him. had never stopped hoping they'd see me as more than just the woman who'd replaced their mother in his bed. But that letter on my kitchen table made it clear Catherine had never accepted our marriage as real, never acknowledged that David had built a life after her that was just as valid, just as meaningful, just as legally binding as anything they'd shared in those 18 turbulent years. Her attorney's words were clinical and cold, claiming that some obscure clause in their 1989 divorce decree entitled her to business assets acquired during their marriage, that the machine shop David had started in 1987, 2 years before their split, technically belonged to her as community property never properly divided. The letter demanded I surrender all financial records, sign over corporate shares, and vacate the commercial property within 60 days, because apparently I had no right to anything David and I had built together, no claim to the company we'd grown from 6 employees to 42, no stake in the government contracts and international clients and patented designs that had transformed a struggling shop into a multi-million-dollar enterprise worth more than I'd ever imagined possible when we started. My first instinct was to call David, to hear his voice telling me this was absurd, to let him handle it the way he'd always handled difficult things, with that calm competence I'd relied on for nearly 3 decades. But David was gone, buried under frozen earth in Section C of Riverside Cemetery, and I was alone in a house that still smelled faintly of his aftershave, surrounded by his coffee mugs and his reading glasses and his worn leather recliner that I couldn't bring myself to move because it felt like erasing him completely. The silence in that kitchen was profound, broken only by the hum of our old refrigerator and the tick of the wall clock his father had made in wood shop class 60 years ago, and I felt something crack inside my chest that wasn't quite grief, because I'd been drowning in grief for 17 days already. This was something sharper, something that tasted like injustice and disrespect, and a fury I hadn't known I was capable of feeling. I'd been raised to be nice, to avoid conflict, to smooth over rough edges, and keep peace even when it cost me pieces of myself. My mother had modeled this perfectly, had stayed married to my father through 43 years of his casual cruelty and wandering eye, had taught me that good women endure and forgive and never make scenes that embarrass the family. I'd carried this training into my adult life like invisible armor that protected others while leaving me exposed, had swallowed disappointment when David's daughters forgot my birthday or excluded me from their group texts, had smiled through holidays where I felt like a guest in my own home, because his children's presence always shifted the dynamic to make me peripheral. But something about Catherine's letter, about the audacity of her trying to steal what David and I had built together, about the assumption that I'd just surrender without a fight, because that's what nice women do. It shattered something fundamental in my carefully maintained composure. I stood up from my kitchen table with legs that felt steadier than they had in weeks, walked to David's home office where his filing cabinet still held 28 years of our life together, and began pulling folders with hands that had stopped shaking. If Catherine wanted a legal battle, if she wanted to pretend our marriage didn't matter, if she thought I'd disappear quietly into whatever shadow she imagined second wives inhabited, she was about to learn exactly how wrong she was. Because I had our marriage certificate from 1997, recorded and notarized and completely legitimate, I had 28 years of joint tax returns showing our combined business income, our shared investments, our unified financial life. I had the updated corporate documents from 2003 when David had restructured the company and made me co-owner, documents he'd insisted on because he'd said if anything ever happened to him, he wanted me protected and provided for without question. Little did I know that morning, pulling files from metal drawers while winter sun painted squares on the hardwood floor, that Catherine's claim was just the beginning of what would become the most challenging 6 months of my life. The next morning I sat across from Arnold Winters, the attorney David had used for business contracts and estate planning for the past 15 years. Arnold's office smelled like old books and furniture polish, his mahogany desk cluttered with legal pads and coffee rings and photographs of grandchildren I'd heard about but never met. He was 71, had practiced law in this town since before I was born, and had the kind of weathered face that suggested he'd seen every variation of human greed and stupidity multiple times over. I'd called him from my car the previous afternoon, had left a message that probably sounded more desperate than professional, and he'd called back within an hour to schedule this early morning appointment before his regular office hours started. I spread Catherine's letter across his desk with hands that wanted to crumple the paper instead, watched his gray eyebrows rise slightly as he read, felt my jaw clench so hard my teeth ached. Arnold had handled David's estate planning 5 years ago, when we'd updated our wills after his first cancer scare, had walked us through trusts and beneficiaries and all the complicated legal structures designed to protect assets from taxes and probate and family disputes. He'd been thorough then, had asked uncomfortable questions about David's relationship with his daughters, had gently suggested provisions that might prevent exactly this kind of challenge. David had waved off those concerns with the optimism that was so characteristic of him, had insisted his girls would never fight over money, that Catherine had her own life and her own husband, and no reason to interfere with our affairs. Arnold finished reading and set the letter down with the careful precision of someone choosing words thoughtfully. His voice was gravelly from decades of cigarettes he'd quit 15 years ago, but whose damage lingered. He asked me about the 1989 divorce decree, whether I'd ever seen the original documents, whether David had mentioned any unusual clauses about future business assets. I told him everything I knew, which wasn't much because David's first marriage had ended 8 years before I'd entered his life, because ex-spouses and old legal documents hadn't seemed relevant when we were building our own future together. I explained how the machine shop had started small, how David had run it from a rented building with 2 employees and equipment bought used from factory auctions, how it hadn't become truly profitable until the late 90s when he'd landed his first major automotive contract. Arnold listened without interrupting, making notes on a yellow pad in handwriting too small for me to read upside down, occasionally nodding in that way attorneys do when they're processing information and formulating strategy simultaneously. When I finished, he leaned back in his leather chair that creaked softly, steepled his fingers under his chin, and asked the question I'd been dreading. Had David's estate been formally probated yet? And what did the will say about the business? I told him probate had just started, that David's will left everything to me except for modest trust funds for his 3 daughters, $50,000 each, which had seemed generous, given that he'd already paid for their educations and weddings and down payments over the years. Arnold's expression tightened slightly, and I felt my stomach drop because I recognized that look as the face attorneys make when they see potential problems their clients don't understand yet. He explained that Catherine's claim, while audacious, wasn't entirely without legal foundation if the divorce decree language was ambiguous about business assets. Many divorces in the late 80s had been handled less precisely than modern ones, especially in cases where assets seemed minimal at the time of separation. If the decree said something vague like husband retains all business interests without specifying whether that included future growth or just current value, if there was any clause about shared community property that hadn't been properly partitioned, Catherine's attorney might argue she'd never relinquished her marital claim to the company's foundational assets. It was a long shot, Arnold assured me, but not impossible, and the mere existence of her claim would complicate probate, delay asset distribution, and potentially tie up the business in legal limbo for months or years depending on how aggressive she wanted to be. I felt my carefully maintained composure start to crack around the edges, like old pottery developing spiderweb fractures. I asked Arnold what Catherine could realistically gain from this, why she'd bother after 30 years and a remarriage and what seemed like a comfortable life of her own. He gave me a look that was equal parts sympathetic and cynical, the look of someone who'd watched human nature reveal itself in estate disputes too many times to maintain any illusions about family loyalty. Money, he said simply, changes people's mathematics about what they deserve, what they're owed, what they should have gotten all along. $12 million was enough to make someone rewrite history, to convince themselves that their contribution to a long-dead marriage entitled them to assets created entirely after that marriage ended. And Catherine probably had her daughters in her ear, Arnold suggested carefully, possibly encouraging her, possibly promising to share in whatever windfall she could extract from David's estate. That possibility, that Emma, Sophie, and Claire might be supporting their mother's claim, might be actively working against me, felt like being punched in the chest by someone you'd never expected to raise a fist. I'd tried so hard with those girls over the years, had attended their events when invited, had sent birthday cards and graduation gifts and baby presents when they'd started families of their own. I'd never tried to replace Catherine, had never demanded they call me anything but my first name, had accepted whatever limited role they'd allowed me in their lives because I'd understood the complexity of their position, the loyalty they felt to their mother, the awkwardness of embracing their father's second wife. But I'd hoped in some deep and probably naive place that they'd at least respect that I'd loved their father genuinely, that our marriage had been real and legitimate, that I'd earned some basic human decency through 28 years of partnership with the man who'd raised them. Arnold must have seen something in my face because his tone softened slightly. He assured me we had strong defenses, the marriage certificate proving legal union, the corporate documents showing joint ownership established decades after the divorce, the will clearly expressing David's intentions, the tax returns demonstrating our shared financial life. But he warned me to prepare for a fight, to expect Catherine to drag this out, to brace myself for uncomfortable revelations and family conflicts that would make the next months emotionally exhausting, regardless of the legal outcome. He recommended we immediately file a response to her claim, that we request copies of the original divorce decree to examine the exact language, that we prepare detailed documentation of every business decision and investment David and I had made together since our marriage. This would cost money, he cautioned, perhaps substantial amounts if Catherine refused to back down. But the alternative was surrendering assets I was legally entitled to, simply because fighting felt too overwhelming. I left Arnold's office that morning with a folder full of papers to sign, and a timeline that stretched months into the future. Drove home through streets that looked different somehow, like the town I'd lived in for decades had shifted into a slightly off-key version of itself. Everything familiar seemed strange now. The coffee shop where David and I had breakfast every Saturday. The park where we'd walked our dog Max before he died 2 years ago. The library where I volunteered shelving books on Thursday afternoons. I'd thought grief was the hardest thing I'd face after losing David. Thought the empty house and the silent mornings and the crushing loneliness of widowhood would be the tests I'd have to endure. But this was different. This was an attack not just on David's legacy, but on the validity of our entire life together. And it required a kind of strength I wasn't sure I possessed. But little did I know what the next week would bring, or how deep Catherine's determination to rewrite history would prove to be. The divorce decree arrived by courier 6 days later, a thick manila envelope that required my signature for delivery. I'd been expecting it because Arnold had requested copies through legal channels, but holding the actual document in my hands, reading the words that had ended David's first marriage 34 years ago, felt invasive somehow, like reading someone's diary without permission. I sat at my kitchen table again, same scarred wood, same weak February sunlight, same blue mug now filled with tea I didn't really want, and forced myself to read every page of legal language that had divided David's life into before and after. The decree was dated November 17, 1989, filed in County Superior Court, signed by Judge Margaret Patterson, who'd retired 15 years ago, and died soon after according to her obituary I'd seen in the local paper. It detailed custody arrangements for 3 minor children, specified child support payments that had continued until each girl turned 18, divided household assets with the kind of tedious specificity that comes from couples who can't agree on anything anymore. Catherine got the 4-bedroom house, the Volvo station wagon, the bedroom furniture, the good china, half the savings account, which totaled $8,200. David got the Ford pickup, the machine shop business including all equipment and inventory, the camping gear, his tools, the other half of the savings account. I read that section 3 times, searching for the clause Catherine's attorney had referenced. the ambiguous language that supposedly entitled her to future business growth. On page 7, paragraph 12, I found it. Wife relinquishes all claims to husband's business interests, including Richmond Machine and Manufacturing, its assets, accounts, and future earnings, in exchange for sole ownership of the marital residence and associated property. It seemed clear enough to me. Catherine had traded her stake in the business for the house, had chosen security over speculation, had taken the guaranteed asset rather than gambling on a struggling machine shop that might never amount to much. But the phrase future earnings was different from future value or future growth, and I could see how a creative attorney might argue that earnings meant profits distributed while the business operated, not the business itself if sold or inherited. Arnold had marked this section with yellow highlighter and a note in the margin. Ambiguous but defensible. Earnings typically means profit distributions, not asset appreciation. I clung to those words like a lifeline, wanted to believe that 34 years of legal precedent and common sense would prevail over Catherine's revisionist interpretation. But I'd learned enough about law from Arnold's careful explanations to know that ambiguous language creates opportunity for dispute, that what seems obvious to reasonable people can be twisted into complicated arguments by attorneys paid to find loopholes and exploit technicalities. The rest of the decree was standard divorce language. Neither party could make disparaging remarks about the other. Both would participate in joint custody arrangements. Child support would be adjusted annually based on income changes. There was nothing about David's obligation to include Catherine in future business decisions. Nothing suggesting she retained any ownership stake. Nothing indicating she had rights to assets acquired or created after the marriage ended. By any reasonable interpretation, David had left that marriage with his struggling machine shop and built everything else afterward through his own effort and intelligence and determination. The fact that I'd been his partner in that building for 28 of those years, that we'd made decisions together and weathered difficulties together and celebrated successes together, should have been indisputable proof that Catherine had no claim to what we'd created. But reasonable interpretation wasn't the same as legal certainty, and Catherine's attorney was clearly betting that ambiguity plus persistence, plus my potential unwillingness to fight, would equal a settlement in their favor. I called Arnold that afternoon and read him the exact wording, asked him to quantify my chances in percentage terms, even though I knew attorneys hated making predictions. He hesitated in that way that meant he was choosing between comforting me and telling me truth, then settled on something in between. Our position was strong, he said, probably 75 to 80% likely to prevail if this went to court. But court meant months of proceedings, depositions, expert witnesses to value the business, accountants to trace asset origins, potentially tens of thousands in legal fees, even with victory. Catherine was counting on me being exhausted, grieving, financially conservative enough to settle for less rather than fight for everything, and her strategy wasn't unreasonable given how many widows chose peace over justice when facing expensive legal battles. I asked Arnold what a settlement might look like, what Catherine might accept to drop her claim and leave me alone. He suggested she probably wanted several million at minimum, enough to feel like she'd won something, enough to share with her daughters if they were indeed supporting her play, enough to validate her narrative that she'd been cheated out of rightful assets during the divorce. The number made my throat close up again because several $1 million wasn't just money. It was years of the business profits that funded my retirement, the cushion that let me donate to causes I cared about, the security that meant I wouldn't spend my 60s and 70s worrying about assisted living costs or medical bills. David had worked so hard to build that security for us, had sacrificed personal comfort and easy leisure to grow the business beyond what anyone thought possible, and the idea of handing chunks of it to his ex-wife because fighting felt too difficult made me physically nauseous. But something else was growing alongside the nausea, something harder and more determined that I barely recognized as part of myself. I'd spent 62 years being accommodating, being pleasant, being the person who bent rather than broke relationships through conflict. I'd let David's daughters keep me at arm's length, had accepted Catherine's cold politeness, had made myself smaller in countless interactions, to avoid making others uncomfortable. And where had that gotten me? Sitting alone in my kitchen while someone tried to steal what my husband and I had built, while his children apparently supported that theft, while everyone seemed to expect me to surrender gracefully, because that's what nice second wives did when first families came calling. I told Arnold I wasn't interested in settling, that I wanted to fight this properly, that whatever it cost in legal fees and emotional energy was worth it, if it meant Catherine learned she couldn't rewrite history to suit her bank account. I heard surprise in his voice when he responded, followed quickly by something that sounded like approval. He said he'd file our response to her claim by end of week, that we'd request depositions from Catherine and her attorney, that we'd make this as difficult and expensive for her as she was making it for me. Sometimes, Arnold said, the best defense against bullies is making them understand you won't be bullied, that you're willing to match their aggression and outlast their determination. That conversation marked a turning point I didn't fully recognize at the time, the moment when grief began transforming into something more active and purposeful. David was gone, and I couldn't bring him back, couldn't hear his voice or feel his hand in mine or laugh at his terrible jokes about engineers and physicists. But I could fight for the life we'd built, could defend the business we'd grown together, could refuse to let Catherine erase 28 years of partnership as if they'd never happened. If that made me less nice, less accommodating, less concerned with keeping peace, then perhaps it was time I learned to be those things, to be the woman who stood firm rather than bent, who valued justice over comfort. Little did I know how many more revelations the next weeks would bring, or how deep the betrayal truly ran. The first deposition was scheduled for March 15th, exactly 6 weeks after David's funeral. Arnold explained depositions as formal question sessions under oath, opportunities for both sides to hear each other's claims directly, to probe for weaknesses or contradictions, to establish facts that might support or undermine legal arguments. Catherine's attorney had requested my deposition first, probably hoping I'd make mistakes or reveal information that helped their case, probably assuming a grieving widow would be easier to rattle than a prepared litigant. Arnold had spent 3 sessions preparing me, asking practice questions, teaching me to answer only what was asked without volunteering extra information, reminding me that attorneys often tried to provoke emotional reactions that made people say things they later regretted. The deposition took place in a conference room at Catherine's attorney's office, a modern glass building downtown that probably cost more per square foot than my house was worth. I dressed carefully that morning, choosing the navy suit I'd worn to business meetings when David and I had pitched to new clients, wanting to project competence and control, even though my stomach was churning with nerves I couldn't quite suppress. Arnold met me in the lobby, squeezed my shoulder in a gesture of encouragement that reminded me of my father before he died, and walked me through security and up elevators that moved too quickly for my comfort. Catherine's attorney was a woman about my age named Patricia Kowalski, with severe dark hair pulled back in a bun that seemed designed to emphasize her sharp features, wearing a gray suit that probably cost what I spent on groceries in 6 months. She greeted us with professional coolness, shook hands with a grip that was slightly too firm, and gestured us into a conference room where a court reporter was already setting up a stenography machine. The room was all glass and steel and uncomfortable modern furniture, with a view of the downtown skyline that would have been impressive if I'd been in any state to appreciate it. Catherine wasn't present. Arnold had explained she didn't need to attend my deposition, that only attorneys and the witness and the court reporter were required. But I felt her presence anyway, like she was watching through the windows somehow. Patricia started with basic questions, establishing my name, age, address, how long I'd known David, when we'd married. Her tone was neutral, but her eyes were calculating, watching my face for reactions, probably trained to notice the micro-expressions that revealed when people were uncomfortable or defensive. I answered calmly, keeping my voice steady, following Arnold's advice to pause before responding, so I didn't rush into answers I hadn't fully considered. Then Patricia shifted to questions about the business. When had I become involved? What were my specific responsibilities? Had I contributed capital or just labor? Did I have formal training in manufacturing or business management? I explained I'd started helping with bookkeeping and invoicing in 1998, had gradually taken over all financial management and customer relations, had been named co-owner in 2003 when David had restructured as an LLC specifically to include me as equal partner. Patricia pounced on that restructuring, asking whose idea it had been, whether I'd requested ownership or David had offered it, whether there had been any written explanation of why the change was necessary. I told her truth. David had insisted on the restructuring after his first cancer scare, had wanted me protected if something happened to him, had valued my contributions enough to make us legal equals. Patricia made notes with a gold pen that probably cost more than my watch, asked whether I'd paid fair market value for my ownership stake or whether it had been a gift disguised as business reorganization. I felt my temper flare at the implication I'd somehow manipulated David, but Arnold's hand on my arm under the table reminded me to stay calm, to answer factually without defensiveness. The questioning continued for 2 hours, circling through the business finances, the decisions David and I had made about expansion and equipment and hiring, whether I'd understood corporate structures or just signed documents David had prepared. Patricia was trying to paint me as an unsophisticated woman who'd been involved in name only, who'd benefited from David's generosity without earning real ownership, who'd merely been along for the ride while he did the actual work of building a valuable company. Every question felt designed to diminish my role, to suggest I was lucky rather than competent, to imply I didn't deserve the assets now in dispute because I hadn't truly created them. But something happened during that deposition that surprised me. I found my voice, not the accommodating voice I'd used for decades, not the pleasant, agreeable tone that kept everyone comfortable, but something firmer and more confident that came from knowing my own truths. I explained in detail how I'd rebuilt the company's accounting systems in 1999 after discovering irregularities, how I'd negotiated better terms with suppliers, how I'd maintained client relationships through David's cancer treatments when he'd been too sick to work. I described specific decisions we'd made together about which contracts to pursue, which employees to hire, which equipment to purchase. I made it clear through facts rather than emotion that I'd been a genuine partner in building the business, that my contributions had been essential to its success, that David's decision to make me co-owner had reflected reality rather than sentiment. Patricia's questions became more aggressive as the deposition progressed, suggesting I'd isolated David from his daughters, that I'd influenced his estate planning to cut them out, that I'd somehow manipulated a dying man into leaving me everything. That accusation broke through my calm like a hammer through glass, and I felt tears of frustration burning behind my eyes, even as I fought to keep my voice level. I responded that David's estate plan had been his decision based on his values, that he'd provided generously for his daughters during his life and left them trust funds in his will, that suggesting I'd manipulated him insulted his intelligence and independence. Arnold called for a break at that point, probably sensing I was reaching emotional limits, and we stepped into the hallway where I could breathe air that didn't taste like accusation and judgment. I asked Arnold if it was always this brutal, if every deposition felt like being attacked by someone determined to make you doubt your own memories and motivations. He said Patricia was being more aggressive than typical, because their case was weak, because they needed me to make mistakes or contradictions they could exploit, because provocation was a standard tactic when facts weren't on your side. He reminded me I'd done well, that my detailed answers had probably strengthened our position, that maintaining composure under pressure demonstrated credibility judges valued. But riding home that afternoon, watching familiar streets blur past my car windows, I felt exhausted in ways that had nothing to do with physical tiredness. This was the weariness of being forced to defend yourself against people who'd already decided you were guilty, the fatigue of explaining your life to strangers who'd never understand because they'd made up their minds before asking the first question. But even through that exhaustion, I felt something else growing, a stubborn determination that surprised me with its intensity. Catherine could attack me, could question my marriage, could try to paint me as some kind of gold digger who tricked her way into David's life and assets, but she couldn't change the facts, couldn't alter the 28 years we'd actually lived, couldn't erase the love and partnership and mutual respect that had defined our marriage. If she wanted to spend her retirement years fighting me in court, wasting money on attorneys and depositions and legal maneuvering, then I'd match her hour for hour, dollar for dollar, until she understood I wasn't the compliant opponent she'd expected. Little did I realize how many more surprises the next weeks would hold, or how much I'd discover about the man I thought I'd known completely. David's attorney records arrived 3 weeks later, delivered by Arnold to my house rather than his office, because he'd said he wanted to discuss them privately before we proceeded. He'd requested them from David's previous attorney, the one who'd handled the 2003 business restructuring before Arnold had taken over estate planning duties. The files contained correspondence, memos, notes from meetings, documentation of decisions I'd known about but never seen the behind-scenes reasoning for. Arnold spread them across my dining room table that had hosted so many dinners and game nights and ordinary evenings, and I felt dread settle in my stomach like cold stone before I'd read a single word. The documents revealed something I hadn't known, something David had never mentioned in all our years together. In 1991, 2 years after his divorce and 6 years before we'd married, Catherine had actually sued him over the business. She'd claimed back then, through a different attorney, that the divorce decree had undervalued the machine shop, that David had hidden assets or potential contracts during the divorce proceedings, that she deserved additional compensation for business growth that had occurred using equipment and clients acquired during their marriage. The lawsuit had dragged on for 8 months before being dismissed by a judge who'd ruled the divorce decree was final and unambiguous, that Catherine had received fair value for the marital assets she'd relinquished, that she couldn't revisit settled matters years later simply because David's business had become more profitable than expected. I stared at those documents with hands that had gone numb, trying to process what this meant. David had faced Catherine's legal challenge before, had weathered her attempt to claim business assets years before I'd ever entered his life, had dealt with this same pattern of aggressive claims and legal maneuvering, and he'd never told me, not once in 28 years, not even when we'd discussed estate planning or business decisions, or his complicated relationship with his daughters. Why would he hide this? Was he embarrassed? Did he think it didn't matter? Or had he been protecting me from knowing exactly how vindictive his ex-wife could be when money was involved? Arnold watched my face with the careful attention of someone reading emotional weather patterns. He said these documents were actually helpful for our case because they established legal precedent. Catherine had already litigated this exact issue and lost, and judges generally didn't let people relitigate settled matters without compelling new evidence. This discovery made our position stronger, gave us ammunition to argue her current claim was frivolous and potentially sanctionable as harassment. But he also cautioned that the documents revealed something about Catherine's character, her willingness to pursue David legally, even when they'd agreed to split everything decades earlier, her apparent belief that she deserved more than what she'd actually been granted in the divorce. I asked Arnold why David would have kept this secret from me, what possible reason he'd have had for never mentioning that Catherine had sued him years before we'd met. Arnold's expression softened with something like sympathy. He suggested gently that David might have wanted to protect me from worry, might have thought the old lawsuit was irrelevant ancient history, might have hoped Catherine had moved on and wouldn't repeat patterns from decades past. Or perhaps, Arnold said even more gently, David had felt some shame about having chosen and married someone who'd later sued him, some embarrassment about his judgment, some desire to present his first marriage as simply an incompatibility, rather than revealing it, had been bitter enough to generate lawsuits. That possibility hurt in unexpected ways, because it suggested David had felt he couldn't be fully honest with me, had thought I needed protection from complicated truths about his past. I'd believed we'd had the kind of marriage where everything was shared, where secrets didn't exist because trust ran deep enough to handle difficult revelations. But maybe I'd been naive about that too. Maybe everyone kept some pieces of their history private. Maybe David had carried burdens he'd thought were his alone to bear. Or maybe he'd simply not wanted to poison my opinion of his daughter's mother, hadn't wanted me to see Catherine as an antagonist because that would have complicated family relationships even further. The revelation about the 1991 lawsuit changed my understanding of Catherine in fundamental ways. I thought her current claim was opportunistic, but basically reasonable given the high stakes involved. $12 million was enough to make anyone reconsider old agreements and question whether they'd received fair treatment decades ago. But knowing she'd sued David before, knowing she had a pattern of aggressive legal action when she felt entitled to more, knowing she'd been willing to fight him even when judges said she had no grounds, it painted a picture of someone driven by grievance rather than justice. Someone who'd spent decades resenting that David's business had succeeded after their divorce. Someone who viewed any wealth he'd accumulated as partially hers regardless of legal reality. And if Catherine had been fighting David over money since 1991, what did that mean about her relationship with their daughters? Had she spent 34 years telling Emma and Sophie and Claire that their father had cheated her in the divorce, that he'd hidden assets, that he'd built his success on foundations that rightfully belonged to her? Had she shaped their understanding of their parents' split in ways that made them see David as dishonest and herself as victim? Was that why his daughters had always been distant with me? Why they'd never fully embraced their father's second marriage? Why they'd stood on the opposite side of the grave at his funeral? Because their mother had spent decades cultivating resentment and loyalty. These questions spiraled through my mind like water circling a drain, pulling me toward darker interpretations of everything I'd observed over 28 years. I'd tried so hard to give those girls grace, to understand their position, to accept their limited affection as natural consequence of being a step-parent to adults. But maybe their coldness hadn't been about me at all, hadn't been about struggling to accept their father's new wife, but about loyalty to a mother who taught them to see David's success as stolen from her, to view his happiness with me as betrayal of their family, to believe that anything he built after leaving their mother was built on foundations that should have been hers. Arnold suggested we use the 1991 lawsuit documents in our response to Catherine's current claim, that we argue she was barred from relitigating settled matters, that we point out the pattern of frivolous legal action designed to harass rather than seek legitimate remedy. But he also warned me this would escalate tensions, would make Catherine and potentially her daughters even more hostile, would turn an already difficult situation into open warfare. I needed to decide whether I was prepared for that level of conflict, whether fighting on principle was worth the emotional cost of completely destroying whatever fragile connection might still exist with David's family. I thought about that question for a long time, sitting at my dining room table with decades of legal documents spread before me like archaeological evidence of lives I'd barely understood, even while living adjacent to them. Part of me wanted peace, wanted to settle for less than I deserved, wanted to preserve some possibility of future relationship with Emma and Sophie and Claire, even though they'd given me little reason to hope for such connection. That was the old me talking, the accommodating woman who'd spent 62 years prioritizing others' comfort over her own needs, who'd made herself smaller to create space for people who'd never appreciated the sacrifice. But another part of me, newer, harder, less willing to be pushed around, recognized that peace built on surrender wasn't really peace at all, that accepting injustice to avoid conflict just invited more injustice, that sometimes the only way to stop bullies was refusing to be bullied regardless of cost. David had loved me enough to make me his equal partner, had trusted me enough to build a life together, had valued me enough to ensure I'd be protected after his death. Surrendering what we'd built together because fighting felt uncomfortable would dishonor that love, would validate Catherine's twisted narrative that our marriage had been less legitimate than hers, would teach David's daughters that aggression and entitlement trumped commitment and partnership. I told Arnold to file whatever response would be most effective, to use the 1991 lawsuit as evidence of Catherine's pattern, to make it absolutely clear I wasn't surrendering anything David and I had built together. If that meant war with his ex-wife and potential permanent estrangement from his daughters, then maybe those were relationships that couldn't survive anyway. Relationships built on such shaky foundations of resentment and misconception that they'd always been destined to crumble eventually. At least this way I'd crumble them while standing firm rather than while backing down. Arnold nodded with something like respect in his eyes and began gathering the documents back into organized folders. As he prepared to leave, he mentioned casually that Catherine's deposition was scheduled for the following week, that I could attend if I wanted to hear her testimony firsthand, though I wasn't required to be present. Something in his tone suggested he thought I should go, that hearing Catherine speak under oath might reveal information useful beyond the legal case, that witnessing her directly might either strengthen my resolve or help me understand her position more sympathetically. I told him I'd be there, that I wanted to hear what Catherine had to say, that I needed to look across a conference table at the woman trying to erase 28 years of my life and understand what drove such determination to steal what wasn't hers. Little did I know what those depositions would reveal, or how dramatically my understanding of David's death would shift in the days ahead. Catherine's deposition was in the same glass-walled conference room where I'd been questioned weeks earlier, but everything felt different from the opposing side of the table. I sat beside Arnold in chairs that were slightly more comfortable than I'd remembered, watching Patricia prepare her client with whispered instructions, while we waited for the court reporter to finish setting up. Catherine looked older than I'd expected. She was 64 to my 62, but the years showed more harshly on her. Lines carved deep around her mouth and eyes, gray roots visible in hair dyed an improbable auburn, hands spotted with age and tension as they clasped a water glass, like it might provide ballast against uncertain seas. She wouldn't look at me directly, kept her eyes focused on Patricia or the table or the court reporter's machine, and I wondered if that avoidance came from guilt or simply discomfort at being in the same room with the woman she was trying to financially destroy. I'd expected to feel hatred sitting across from her, expected my carefully controlled anger to boil over into something visible and volatile. But instead I felt an odd sense of pity mixed with curiosity, looking at this stranger who'd shared 18 years of David's life, who'd borne his children, who'd apparently spent the past 3 decades resenting that he'd moved on and found happiness after their marriage failed. Arnold began questioning with the same professional courtesy Patricia had shown me, establishing basic facts about Catherine's marriage to David, the timeline of their divorce, her understanding of the settlement terms. Catherine's voice was thin and defensive from the start, answering with minimal words like she'd been coached to avoid volunteering information. Yes, she'd been married to David from 1971 to 1989. Yes, they'd divorced due to irreconcilable differences. Yes, she'd received the house and custody of 3 daughters, while David had kept the struggling machine shop. Her answers painted a picture of someone who'd felt cheated even then, who'd taken what seemed like the safe bet, real estate over uncertain business, and had watched David prove her calculation wrong by building that uncertain business into something valuable. Arnold asked about the 1991 lawsuit, watching Catherine's face as he mentioned it like he was waiting for a specific reaction. Catherine's jaw tightened visibly, and her fingers went white around the water glass. She admitted she'd sued David over the business valuation, claimed she'd had good reason to believe he'd hidden potential contracts during their divorce proceedings, that she'd only been seeking fair compensation for assets built during their marriage. Arnold pushed gently. How had she concluded David had hidden contracts when the judge had found no evidence of deception? Catherine's answer revealed more than she probably intended. She'd heard from someone at the shop that David had been in discussions with a major automotive client months before their divorce was finalized, conversations he'd never disclosed during asset valuation. I felt my breath catch because this was new information, a glimpse into why Catherine had believed she'd been cheated. If David had indeed been negotiating a major contract during the divorce without disclosing it, that would explain her suspicion, even if the judge had ultimately ruled against her. But it also revealed something about Catherine's information sources. Someone at the shop had been feeding her details about business operations, even after the divorce. Someone had been acting as her spy, or at minimum her sympathetic informant. I wondered who that person had been, whether they'd still worked for us when I joined the company years later, whether they'd resented my presence as much as Catherine apparently had. Arnold moved to questions about Catherine's knowledge of David's remarriage, asking when she'd learned about our wedding, how she'd felt about David's decision to marry again. Catherine's composure slipped slightly, and I saw something raw in her expression, something that might have been pain or jealousy, or simply the sting of being replaced in any fashion. She said she'd heard about the marriage from Emma, that David hadn't told her directly, that she'd been surprised he'd chosen to marry someone so much younger. That detail stung. I'd been 34 to David's 43 when we'd married. 9 years hardly seemed like a scandalous age gap, but apparently Catherine had viewed it as significant enough to mention even 2 decades later. Arnold asked whether Catherine had maintained any communication with David after his remarriage, whether they'd discussed the business or his estate planning. Catherine admitted they'd barely spoken in the past 28 years, beyond logistics around their daughters' weddings and grandchildren's births. She hadn't known about the 2003 business restructuring until recently, hadn't known I'd been made co-owner, hadn't known David had left almost everything to me in his will. Her ignorance seemed genuine, and I felt a flicker of sympathy despite everything. She'd been completely disconnected from David's life for nearly 3 decades, and then he'd died and she'd discovered he'd accumulated millions she'd never known about. Wealth she'd calculated should partially be hers, because it had originated in a business started during their marriage. But Arnold's next question shattered any sympathy I'd been nurturing. When had Catherine first considered claiming a stake in David's estate, and whose idea had it been? Catherine hesitated long enough that Patricia intervened with a reminder she needed to answer honestly. Catherine finally admitted that Sophie, her middle daughter, had suggested she review the original divorce decree after David's funeral, had pointed out the ambiguous language about future earnings, had researched attorneys specializing in estate disputes, and found Patricia's name. Sophie had encouraged her mother to assert her rights, had said David had been unfair in his will by leaving his daughters only $50,000 each when the business was worth millions, had argued that Catherine deserved compensation for the years she'd supported David while he built the foundation of his success. That revelation hit me like physical force because it confirmed what I'd suspected but hoped wasn't true. David's own daughter had instigated her mother's claim, had actively encouraged this attack on my financial security, had presumably done so out of resentment that her father had left most of his estate to his second wife rather than his children. Sophie had studied law before switching to marketing, would have known exactly what language to look for in the divorce decree, would have understood how to frame Catherine's claim to make it seem legitimate, and she'd convinced her mother to pursue it, despite knowing it would devastate me, despite understanding it would destroy any remaining connection between David's 2 families, despite recognizing the bitterness it would create. I must have made some sound, because Arnold glanced at me with concern, but I shook my head slightly to indicate I was fine, even though I felt like the floor had dropped away beneath my chair. All those I felt the weight of Sophie's betrayal settle into my bones, like cold spreading through water, transforming everything I'd believed about David's daughters into something darker and more calculated. Arnold continued questioning Catherine about her daughter's involvement, asking whether Emma and Claire had also supported the claim or if Sophie had acted alone. Catherine admitted that all 3 daughters had encouraged her to pursue what they called her rightful share, that they'd had family meetings discussing the unfairness of David's will, that they felt he'd been influenced against them during his final years by someone who'd isolated him from his first family, that someone was clearly me, though Catherine didn't say my name, just let the accusation hang in the air like smoke that contaminated everything it touched. Arnold asked Catherine to explain what she meant by isolation, to provide specific examples of how I'd supposedly separated David from his daughters. Catherine struggled with this, offering vague complaints about missed holidays and unreturned phone calls, about feeling unwelcome at David's house, about sensing that their father had changed after his remarriage in ways that made him less available to his children. But when Arnold pressed for concrete incidents, for actual evidence of manipulation or interference, Catherine couldn't provide any because there hadn't been any. I'd never prevented David from seeing his daughters, never complained about their visits, never suggested he reduce contact or limit their involvement in his life. If anything, I'd encouraged connection even when it cost me comfort, had welcomed them into our home even when they treated me like invisible furniture, had tried to build bridges they'd refused to cross. The truth was simpler and sadder than Catherine's narrative. David's daughters had been in their 20s when we'd married, busy with their own lives and relationships and careers, naturally distancing from their father as adult children do. I'd been convenient scapegoat for that natural distance, easy to blame for changes that would have happened regardless of my presence. And Catherine had apparently encouraged that blame over the years, had perhaps needed someone to fault for the fact that her daughter's relationship with their father hadn't been as close as she'd imagined it should be, had found it easier to point fingers at the second wife than to examine whether her own bitterness might have influenced how her children viewed their father's new life. Arnold shifted questions to Catherine's current financial situation, asking about her assets, her husband Robert's income, whether she had actual financial need, or if this claim was purely about principle. Catherine bristled at these questions, said her finances weren't relevant to whether she'd been treated fairly in the 1989 divorce. But Arnold persisted with the patience of someone who knew exactly where he was going, and eventually, Catherine admitted she and Robert lived comfortably in a paid-off house, that they had retirement accounts and no significant debts, that she wasn't facing any financial crisis that would justify desperate measures. This established what Arnold had suspected. Catherine's claim wasn't about need, but about perceived entitlement, about wanting what she thought she deserved, rather than what she actually required to maintain her lifestyle. Patricia tried to redirect the deposition toward questions that supported their case, asking Catherine to describe her contributions to David's business during their marriage, to explain how she'd supported his early efforts to establish the machine shop. Catherine described typical spouse support. She'd managed their household while David worked long hours, had raised their daughters largely alone when he was building the business, had economized on family expenses so he could reinvest profits into equipment and inventory. These were real contributions that deserved acknowledgement, but they weren't unique. Millions of spouses made similar sacrifices for their partners' careers without expecting ownership stakes in businesses built after marriages ended. Catherine had been compensated through child support and the house she'd received in the divorce, through the stable life David had provided while they were married, through the college educations he'd funded for their daughters even after the split. But listening to Catherine describe those years, I understood something I hadn't fully grasped before. She'd built her entire identity around being David's wife and the mother of his children, and when that marriage ended, she'd lost not just a relationship, but her sense of purpose and value. She'd remarried within 3 years to Robert, had presumably found some happiness in that second union, but she'd never stopped measuring her worth against David's trajectory, never stopped comparing what she'd received in the divorce against what he'd accumulated afterward. Every news about his success, contracts landed, business expansions, property purchases, had probably felt like personal diminishment to her, like proof that she'd been discarded for something better, that the years she'd given him had been undervalued by courts and attorneys who didn't understand what she'd sacrificed. This realization didn't make me sympathize with her claim, didn't justify her attempt to steal assets David and I had built together, but it did make me understand her desperation more clearly. Catherine wasn't just fighting for money. She was fighting to prove her decades-old marriage had mattered more than my newer one, that her contributions to David's life had been more valuable than mine, that she deserved recognition as the real foundation of his success, even if legal documents said otherwise. It was sad and misguided and ultimately destructive, but it came from a place of deep insecurity about whether her life had amounted to anything beyond being someone's first wife. The deposition lasted nearly 4 hours, circling through the same territory from different angles as Arnold probed for inconsistencies, and Patricia tried to rehabilitate her client's weaker answers. By the end, Catherine looked exhausted, her auburn hair slightly disheveled, her makeup showing cracks around her eyes and mouth. She still wouldn't look at me directly, maintained that careful avoidance that suggested either guilt or hatred, or perhaps both twisted together. When the court reporter finally announced we were finished, Catherine gathered her things quickly, and left with Patricia without a word to anyone, her posture rigid, with something that might have been embarrassment or defiance. Arnold and I sat in that conference room for a few minutes after they'd gone, neither of us speaking, both processing what we'd heard. Finally, Arnold said what I'd been thinking. Catherine's deposition had actually strengthened our case significantly because it revealed her claim was motivated by resentment rather than legitimate legal grounds, because it showed her daughter's manipulation rather than Catherine's independent decision-making, because it established she had no financial need that would make a court sympathetic to her position. But it had also revealed how deep the family dysfunction ran, how completely David's daughters blamed me for their complicated relationship with their father, how impossible any future reconciliation would be after this legal battle concluded. I asked Arnold whether we should reach out to Emma or Sophie or Claire directly, whether there was any possibility of conversation that might diffuse tensions before this escalated further. He advised against it strongly. Anything I said to them could be misconstrued or used against me, could be twisted into evidence of manipulation or harassment, could complicate the legal proceedings by creating additional conflicts. Better to maintain complete separation until the case resolved, to let the law handle what conversation couldn't fix, to accept that some relationships were too damaged to salvage even with best intentions. Driving home that evening through streets now familiar again, after their brief strangeness, I thought about David's daughters and wondered what he would have made of all this. Would he have been shocked that Sophie had instigated her mother's claim? Would he have been disappointed by Emma and Claire's support of that strategy? Or would he have understood something about his children's character that he'd never shared with me? Some awareness that they'd always viewed his success as partially stolen from their mother. Some recognition that his second marriage had created resentments that would surface eventually. Little did I know that the next discovery would reveal just how much David had understood about his family's dynamics and how carefully he'd planned for exactly this scenario. The locked drawer in David's office desk had never particularly interested me during his life. I'd assumed it held business documents or personal papers he wanted secure, had respected his privacy enough never to ask about it or try to open it. But cleaning out his office 6 weeks after his funeral, sorting through files and deciding what to keep and what to donate, I'd found the small brass key taped to the underside of his desk lamp, tucked where only someone cleaning thoroughly would discover it. The drawer opened with slight resistance, revealing contents that made my breath catch. A leather journal, thick with entries in David's precise engineer's handwriting, and a sealed envelope with my name on the front in letters that looked shaky, like he'd written it during one of his bad days when treatment had made his hands unsteady. I sat on the floor of David's office with those items in my lap, afternoon sun streaming through windows that needed cleaning, dust motes floating in golden light like tiny ghosts. Part of me wanted to open both immediately, to discover whatever secrets David had felt necessary to lock away. But another part hesitated, afraid of what I might learn, worried that the man I'd loved and mourned might reveal himself to be someone different than I'd believed, that the marriage I'd thought was transparent might contain shadows I hadn't known existed. The journal won over the letter because it felt less immediately intimate, less like a direct confrontation with David's ghost. I opened to random pages first, skimming entries that dated back years, reading fragments of David's thoughts about business decisions, concerns about employee performance, notes about equipment maintenance schedules, normal things that explained why he'd kept a locked journal, proprietary business information he didn't want casually accessible if someone visited his office. But then I found entries about his daughters, pages and pages of agonized reflection about his relationship with Emma and Sophie and Claire, and suddenly the journal transformed from mundane business record to intimate portrait of a father's heartbreak. David had known his daughters resented me, had understood their loyalty to Catherine, made them view his second marriage as betrayal, had recognized years before his death that they'd never truly accept me as legitimate part of their family. He'd tried countless times to bridge those gaps. Invitations to dinners they'd declined, gifts they'd accepted without warmth, attempts at conversation they'd answered with polite distance. The journal entries detailed his growing realization that his children had been influenced by their mother's bitterness, that Catherine had spent decades teaching them to see his success as stolen from her, that they measured his worth primarily through what he provided financially rather than who he was as person. It was devastating reading, watching David process the slow death of relationships he desperately wanted to maintain, seeing him come to terms with the fact that blood didn't guarantee connection, that being a father didn't automatically earn respect from adult children who'd been taught to view you through lens of someone else's resentment. One entry from 3 years ago made tears burn behind my eyes. Sophie called today asking for money to invest in her business idea. $20,000 promised as loan, but we both know she'll never repay it. I said yes because saying no means not hearing from her for months, because financial support is the only language she seems to understand anymore. But it breaks my heart that I've become an ATM to my own children, that they call when they need something, but never just to talk, never just to say they love me or ask how I'm doing. Claire does the same thing, though she's more subtle about it. Only Emma sometimes calls without asking for anything, and even then I sense she's keeping me at distance, like she's afraid getting close would betray her mother somehow. I wonder if I failed them as father, if I should have fought harder during the divorce to make Catherine stop poisoning them against me. But maybe this is just what happens when marriages end badly and children have to choose sides. Someone always becomes the villain in a narrative you can't control. I cried reading that entry, mourned for David and the pain he carried silently, felt guilty that I hadn't understood how deeply his daughter's distance hurt him. He'd hidden it well during our marriage, had maintained optimistic front about family relationships even when evidence suggested otherwise, had protected me from knowing the full extent of how completely his children had rejected not just me, but him by extension. I'd thought his financial generosity toward them, paying for weddings and houses and business ventures, came from fatherly love and abundance. But reading his journal, I understood it had been a desperate attempt to maintain connection through the only channel they'd left open, to prove his value through providing even when they wouldn't accept his presence or affection. The journal entries closer to his death became even more revealing. David had updated his will during his final cancer treatment, had made conscious decision to leave his daughters modest trusts rather than equal shares of the estate. He'd written pages explaining his reasoning. They'd already received hundreds of thousands in lifetime gifts. They had stable careers and marriages. They'd shown more interest in his money than his company. Meanwhile, I'd been his genuine partner for 28 years, had supported him through health crises and business challenges, had earned co-ownership through actual contribution rather than biological accident. He'd wanted me secure after his death, wanted the business to continue under my management, wanted his legacy preserved by someone who'd actually helped build it, rather than divided among children who'd view it merely as windfall to be liquidated. But David had also predicted exactly what would happen after his death. Catherine would challenge the will with Sophie's encouragement. His daughters would support their mother's claim. I'd face legal battle designed to wear me down emotionally and financially until I settled for less than I deserved. He'd planned for this scenario by making sure corporate documents were immaculate, by ensuring our marriage certificate and joint tax returns and ownership records were perfectly documented, by leaving detailed notes in his journal about family dynamics that might help me understand what I was facing. David had loved me enough to armor me against his family's predictable betrayal, had protected me even from beyond the grave with careful preparation and thorough documentation. The final entries in the journal, written days before his death when hospice nurses had been managing his pain, were addressed directly to me. His handwriting was barely legible, shaky and faint, but the words were clear enough. My dearest love, if you're reading this, it means I'm gone, and you've found my attempt to leave you everything you need to fight what's coming. Catherine will come for the business. She always wanted it even though she chose the house in the divorce, always resented that I proved her wrong by making it successful. Sophie will help her because Sophie inherited her mother's sense of entitlement without her mother's original charm. They'll try to make you doubt yourself, to make you feel like you don't deserve what we built together, to convince you that settling is easier than fighting. Please don't let them win. You earned every dollar, every asset, every bit of security I'm leaving you. You were my real partner, my genuine love, the person who saw me as more than paycheck or status symbol. Fight for us, fight for what we created together. Fight because surrendering would mean they win twice. Once by taking our assets, and once by making you doubt that our marriage mattered as much as theirs did. You're stronger than you know, tougher than you believe, more capable than you've ever let yourself imagine. I've always seen that strength in you even when you couldn't see it yourself. Use it now. Make them understand you're not the compliant opponent they expect. I love you more than words can express, more than this shaky handwriting can properly convey. All my love forever, David. I sobbed reading those words, holding the journal against my chest like it might somehow bring him back, feeling the devastating finality of death mixed with furious gratitude that he'd known exactly what would happen and had tried to prepare me. David had understood his family better than I'd given him credit for, had seen their character clearly even while hoping he was wrong, had loved me enough to ensure I wouldn't face their betrayal defenseless. The locked drawer hadn't contained secrets that diminished him. It contained evidence of his protection, his foresight, his determination to take care of me, even when he couldn't be physically present to defend me. The sealed envelope with my name felt less frightening now, though my hands still trembled slightly opening it. Inside was a letter typed on his personal stationery, dated 3 months before his death, formal in tone because it was clearly meant as legal document as much as personal message. David explained that he'd established a separate account containing $200,000 held in trust specifically for legal fees related to defending his estate against challenges. The account information was attached, along with authorization granting me sole access. He'd funded this separate trust precisely because he'd known Catherine and his daughters would contest his will, had wanted to ensure I could afford competent legal representation without depleting the actual estate assets they'd be fighting over. That revelation, that David had been so certain of his family's betrayal, that he'd set aside significant money just for legal defense, should probably have made me angry at him for not warning me directly, for not preparing me emotionally as well as financially. But instead I felt overwhelmed with love for this man who'd anticipated everything, who'd protected me so thoroughly, who'd loved me enough to plan for contingencies even while hoping they'd never materialize. The $200,000 meant I could fight Catherine as long as necessary without worrying about costs, could match her aggression without fear of bankruptcy, could honor David's wish that I stand firm because he'd given me the resources to do so. I called Arnold immediately, still sitting on David's office floor with journal and letter spread around me, voice thick with tears I didn't try to hide. I told him about the locked drawer, the journal entries, the separate legal defense fund David had established. Arnold's response carried surprise, followed quickly by professional appreciation. David had been remarkably thorough, had created paper trail, documenting his reasoning and his predictions, had provided resources that would let us fight indefinitely if necessary. The journal entries about his daughter's entitlement and Catherine's ongoing resentment would be powerful evidence of David's clear-minded decision-making when he'd structured his will, would demonstrate his estate plan, reflected careful thought rather than end-of-life confusion or undue influence. Arnold asked if I was ready to escalate our response, now that I knew David had predicted and prepared for this exact battle. I told him yes without hesitation, told him to use every resource David had provided, told him I'd fight exactly as hard as David had wanted me to fight, because surrendering would dishonor his memory and his love and his faith in my strength. Arnold said he'd file motions attaching relevant journal entries as exhibits, that he'd reference the 1991 lawsuit as pattern of harassment, that he'd make Catherine's attorney understand this wasn't going to be the easy settlement they'd hoped for. We'd force them to actually litigate their weak claim, expose how thoroughly Sophie had manipulated her mother, demonstrate to any judge reviewing the case that Catherine's action was motivated by jealousy and greed rather than legitimate legal grounds. Little did Catherine know that her attempt to erase 28 years of my marriage would instead illuminate exactly how much David had loved me, how completely he'd trusted me, how determined he'd been to ensure his family couldn't destroy what we'd built together. The next phase of the legal battle unfolded with the slow, grinding intensity of glaciers, reshaping landscape. Inexorable, powerful, impossible to ignore, even when you desperately wanted to look away. Arnold filed our enhanced response using David's journal entries and the separate legal fund as evidence of his clear intentions and thorough planning. Catherine's attorney, Patricia, responded with outrage, claiming the journal was self-serving narrative David had created to justify cutting his daughters out of their inheritance, that it proved he'd been influenced against his family, rather than documenting legitimate concerns. But judges generally gave significant weight to personal writings created without expectation of litigation, and David's journal entries dated back years, showing consistent pattern of concern rather than recent fabrication. The case moved to formal discovery phase, where both sides could request documents and testimony from witnesses who might have relevant information. Arnold subpoenaed employment records from Richmond Machine and Manufacturing, going back decades, wanting to identify the employee who'd fed Catherine information about business operations during and after the 1991 lawsuit. He requested financial records showing every gift or payment David had made to his daughters over the years, wanting to demonstrate the hundreds of thousands they'd already received. He demanded communications between Catherine and her daughters discussing the estate, wanting evidence of Sophie's instigation and manipulation. Patricia countered by subpoenaing my personal financial records, bank statements showing how I'd benefited from marriage to David, evidence of any prenuptial agreements or financial arrangements that might suggest I'd married for money rather than love. This invasion of privacy felt violating, even though Arnold had warned it was standard practice, even though I had nothing to hide, and every document would only strengthen my case. Still, having strangers pore through decades of my banking and spending patterns, analyzing every purchase and transfer and investment to determine whether I'd been gold digger or genuine partner, it stripped away dignity in ways that made me understand why so many people settled rather than endured the exposure litigation required. But I'd promised David I'd fight, and his journal entries had given me clarity about what was actually at stake here. This wasn't just about money or business assets. It was about whether the marriage that had defined my adult life would be validated or dismissed, whether my 28 years of partnership would count for something or be erased by people who'd never valued them. Every document I provided, every deposition I endured, every legal maneuver I authorized was battled to prove that second marriages mattered as much as first ones, that chosen families had equal standing with biological ones, that love and commitment created legitimate claims regardless of whether children resulted. The discovery process revealed information that transformed my understanding of several key relationships. The employee who'd informed Catherine about business operations in the early 90s was a bookkeeper named Janet Corrigan, who'd worked for David from 1988 to 1995 before retiring. Janet had apparently maintained friendship with Catherine after the divorce, had viewed David's remarriage to me as betrayal of his first family, had fed Catherine information about contracts and profits during the years leading up to the 1991 lawsuit. Janet was now 78, living in Arizona, but Patricia subpoenaed her testimony anyway, hoping she'd provide evidence that David had hidden assets during the divorce. Instead, Janet's deposition revealed her as a bitter woman who'd resented David's success, who'd felt he hadn't appreciated her contributions, who'd befriended Catherine primarily because they'd shared grievance against men they both felt had wronged them. The financial records showing David's gifts to his daughters were even more revealing. Between 1997 and his death in 2025, David had given Emma, Sophie, and Claire a combined total of $642,000, wedding costs, house down payments, car purchases, business investments, bail money when Sophie's husband had been arrested for DUI, medical bills when Emma's son had needed surgery, constant smaller loans that were never repaid. David had tracked every dollar in meticulous spreadsheets, had documented promises to repay that were never honored, had created clear paper trail showing his daughters treated him as unlimited funding source while providing minimal emotional connection in return. The $50,000 he'd left each of them in trust funds wasn't stingy. It was what remained of his fatherly generosity after decades of taking without gratitude. Most damaging to Catherine's case were the text messages and emails between her and her daughters discussing David's will after his death. Sophie had written to her mother 3 days after the funeral. "Mom, Dad's will is outrageous. He left almost everything to her like we don't matter at all. You need to look at your divorce decree. There might be language that lets you claim the business. I'll help you find an attorney who specializes in estate disputes. This isn't right, and we're not going to just accept it." Catherine had responded, "I always knew that woman would turn him against his own children. Your father built that business while we were married. I deserve something for the years I supported him when it was just struggling shop." The texts continued for days, Sophie researching attorneys and legal theories, Catherine working herself into righteous fury, both of them convincing each other that David's will was somehow invalid because it didn't prioritize biological children over second wife. Arnold filed these communications as exhibits demonstrating that Catherine's claim had been manufactured by Sophie rather than arising from Catherine's independent legal research, that the entire lawsuit was a revenge-motivated attempt to punish me for having married their father and been valued by him more than they were. Patricia tried to get the texts excluded as private family communications, but the judge ruled they were relevant to determining whether Catherine's claim had legitimate legal basis or was harassment disguised as litigation. Seeing a judge validate what I'd suspected all along, that this was attack rather than legitimate dispute, felt like first breath after being underwater too long. First evidence that truth might actually matter in an arena where I'd feared only technical legalities carried weight. The case was scheduled for summary judgment hearing in mid-May, 3 months after David's death. 5 months of legal battle that had aged me in ways that had nothing to do with calendar time. Summary judgment meant the judge would review all evidence both sides had presented and decide whether Catherine's claim had sufficient merit to warrant actual trial or whether it could be dismissed without need for jury to hear arguments. Arnold was confident we'd prevail. Our evidence was overwhelming, our documentation was thorough, our legal arguments were solid. But he also cautioned that judges sometimes avoided summary dismissal, even when they thought one side would ultimately lose, preferring to let juries make difficult decisions rather than taking responsibility for potentially controversial rulings. The hearing took place in County Superior Court on a Tuesday morning when spring rain drummed against tall windows, creating background rhythm that seemed appropriate for the showdown 3 months of preparation had built toward. The courtroom was formal space with dark wood paneling and uncomfortable gallery benches, presided over by Judge Michael Chen, who was 56, according to internet research I'd done, appointed to the bench 8 years ago. Reputation for no-nonsense efficiency and impatience with frivolous litigation. Catherine sat with Patricia at the plaintiff's table looking pale and nervous, while I sat beside Arnold at the defense table, trying to project confidence I didn't entirely feel, despite Arnold's assurances. Patricia presented Catherine's argument first, claiming the 1989 divorce decree's language about future earnings was ambiguous enough to support Catherine's claim to ongoing business appreciation, that David had built Richmond Machine and Manufacturing, using skills and contacts developed during his marriage to Catherine. That fairness required she receive some portion of assets that wouldn't exist without foundation established during their 18-year union. Patricia's presentation was competent and professional, but it felt thin, like elegant wrapping around package containing nothing substantial. She couldn't point to specific clause clearly entitling Catherine to post-divorce business assets, couldn't explain why the 1991 lawsuit dismissal didn't bar this identical claim, couldn't provide compelling reason why David's clear, testamentary intentions should be overridden by ex-wife's belated objections. Arnold's response was methodical destruction of every argument Patricia had raised. He walked Judge Chen through the divorce decree language, showed how future earnings had been standard phrasing, meaning profit distributions rather than asset appreciation, referenced the 1991 case where Judge had already ruled this exact language didn't entitle Catherine to post-divorce business growth. He presented David's journal entries showing conscious decision-making about estate distribution, displayed spreadsheets documenting hundreds of thousands already given to daughters during lifetime, revealed text messages proving Sophie had instigated Catherine's claim rather than Catherine reaching independent conclusion about her rights. Arnold's presentation built inexorably towards single conclusion. Catherine's claim was not good faith dispute about ambiguous contract language, but calculated attempt to extract money from estate she had no legitimate claim to. Motivated by jealousy and encouraged by daughters who felt entitled to inheritance, their father had deliberately chosen not to provide. Judge Chen asked several pointed questions during Arnold's presentation, seeming particularly interested in the 1991 lawsuit and why Patricia thought res judicata, the doctrine preventing re-litigation of settled matters, didn't apply here. Patricia argued the current claim was different because it involved David's death rather than divorce interpretation, but Judge Chen's skeptical expression suggested he wasn't persuaded by that distinction. The judge also questioned Patricia about Sophie's role in initiating the claim, asking whether Catherine had consulted with independent attorney before filing or whether she'd relied entirely on her daughter's legal research and attorney selection. Patricia tried to frame this as natural family consultation, but Judge Chen's questions made clear he saw potential undue influence by daughter with financial interest in increasing mother's recovery. The hearing lasted nearly 3 hours, both attorneys presenting arguments and counter-arguments and responses to judicial questions that revealed how thoroughly they'd each prepared for this moment. When Judge Chen finally called for recess to review materials and prepare his ruling, I felt exhausted tension in every muscle, like I'd been holding physical weight above my head for duration of the proceedings. Arnold patted my shoulder reassuringly and said we'd done everything possible, that the outcome was now out of our hands, that we should hear the judge's decision within an hour after he'd reviewed the key documents one more time. Little did I know that Judge Chen's ruling would not only resolve Catherine's claim, but would fundamentally reshape my understanding of what justice looked like and what it meant to defend something worth defending. We returned to the courtroom 53 minutes later, reconvening in the same seats that had left indentations in my body and my psyche. Judge Chen entered from his chambers carrying folders thick with documents, his expression carefully neutral in the way judges cultivated when they were about to deliver rulings that would make one side very unhappy. The courtroom felt heavy with anticipation, rain still drumming against windows like impatient fingers tapping. Catherine's hands clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles showed white even from across the aisle. Judge Chen began by summarizing the case facts, reciting timeline and key arguments with precision that suggested he'd paid close attention during the hearing and had reviewed materials thoroughly during recess. Then he delivered his ruling in language that was both legally precise and unexpectedly blunt. Catherine Richmond had no valid claim to assets of Richmond Machine and Manufacturing, or to the estate of David Richmond beyond what was already allocated to her in the thoroughly litigated 1989 divorce decree. The phrase, future earnings in that decree, referred unambiguously to profit distributions during business operation, not to asset appreciation or estate value after death. The 1991 lawsuit had already litigated and dismissed this exact interpretation, creating binding precedent that prevented Catherine from relitigating the same claim under slightly different circumstances. David Richmond's journal entries demonstrated clear-minded estate planning reflecting thoughtful consideration of family dynamics, not end-of-life confusion or undue influence. The corporate documents establishing joint ownership between David and me in 2003 were properly executed and clearly expressed his intention that I would inherit the business we'd built together. Judge Chen didn't stop at simple dismissal of Catherine's claim. He went further, stating that the evidence suggested Catherine's lawsuit had been filed in bad faith, motivated by financial opportunism rather than good faith legal dispute, instigated by a daughter with sophisticated legal knowledge who should have recognized the claim lacked merit. While Judge Chen said he wouldn't impose sanctions sua sponte on his own initiative, He was granting me the right to file motion for attorney's fees and costs, indicating his belief that Catherine should be required to reimburse me for the expense of defending against a frivolous claim. This was stronger outcome than Arnold had predicted. Not just victory but validation, not just dismissal but judicial acknowledgement that Catherine's actions had been inappropriate and potentially sanctionable. I felt something release in my chest that I hadn't realized I'd been holding, some coiled tension that had lived in my body for 3 months of legal battle. Catherine made a small sound that might have been grief or shock, and Patricia placed a hand on her client's arm in gesture that looked like both comfort and restraint. Judge Chen continued, saying he understood family disputes over estates were emotionally charged, that grief could cloud judgment. The children sometimes felt entitled to inheritances their parents chose to distribute differently. But the law was clear. Competent adults had the right to leave their assets to whomever they chose. Ex-spouses had no claim to property acquired after divorce unless specifically stated in decree, and tactical litigation designed to pressure settlements from grieving widows would not be tolerated in his courtroom. The judge's final statement was directed at Catherine specifically. Mrs. Richmond, I recognize you may feel your contributions to your ex-husband's early success entitled you to share in his later prosperity. But the law doesn't work on fairness as you subjectively define it. It works on contracts and clear language and established precedent. You negotiated a divorce settlement 36 years ago, accepted its terms, even litigated those terms once before, and lost. Your feelings about that settlement now, informed by your ex-husband's subsequent success and his choice to remarry, don't create legal rights you didn't have before. I suggest you make peace with decisions made decades ago and allow Mr. Richmond's widow to grieve without continued legal harassment. Judge Chen stood, gathering his materials, and court was adjourned before Catherine or Patricia could respond. I sat frozen for a moment, processing victory that felt both complete and somehow anticlimactic. 3 months of stress and fear and anger resolved in 50-minute judicial ruling that affirmed what I'd known all along, but had been forced to prove through exhausting process. Arnold was already standing, shaking my hand formally, before pulling me into brief hug that communicated relief and congratulations, telling me we'd won decisively, that Judge Chen's language about bad faith and sanctions meant Catherine would think twice before attempting any appeals. Catherine left the courtroom quickly, keeping her eyes down, Patricia following with briefcase and defeated posture. They didn't look at me, didn't speak, just disappeared through heavy doors like ghosts fading in daylight. I watched them go with emotions so complicated I couldn't have named them all. Triumph mixed with sadness, vindication mixed with regret that it had come to this, satisfaction mixed with exhaustion that left me feeling hollowed out despite victory. I defended what David and I built together, had proven our marriage mattered, had demonstrated I wouldn't be bullied into surrender. But the cost had been complete rupture with David's daughters, permanent estrangement from women I'd once hoped might someday accept me, confirmation that some families were too broken to repair, even with best intentions. Arnold walked me to my car through rain that had gentled to mist, talking about next steps, filing the fee motion Judge Chen had authorized, finalizing probate now that Catherine's claim was dismissed, transferring business assets into my name permanently. Legal work remained, paperwork to complete, but the battle was essentially over. I'd won everything that mattered in legal terms, had retained the business and the assets and the security David had wanted me to have. But sitting in my car, in the courthouse parking lot, watching rain blur my windshield, I felt a strange emptiness that sometimes follows victory, the absence of something to fight against, the removal of urgent purpose that had defined my days for months. Little did I know that the truest test of what I'd fought for was still ahead, that defending assets was only the beginning of honoring what David and I had built together. The weeks after Judge Chen's ruling unfolded with unexpected quietness, like world had been holding breath during legal battle, and now exhaled slowly back to normal rhythms. Catherine didn't appeal the decision. Arnold had been right that Judge Chen's harsh language about bad faith made further litigation risky, especially since I'd filed motion for attorney's fees, requesting $93,000 to cover my legal costs. Patricia had negotiated that down to $68,000, amount Catherine paid without contest, apparently preferring to cut losses rather than risk additional sanctions. The money arrived as cashier's check delivered by courier. No personal note or acknowledgement, just transaction completing what Catherine had started and lost. Emma, Sophie, and Claire never reached out, never sent condolence cards or phone calls or any communication, acknowledging their roles in their mother's failed attack on my security. I'd expected nothing from them, but still felt the absence like bruise that throbbed when pressed. These were women I'd known for 28 years, women whose weddings I'd attended, and whose babies I'd held, and whose careers I'd followed with genuine interest, even when they gave me little encouragement. But their silence after the judgment was statement clearer than words could have been. They'd supported their mother's claim. They'd hoped I'd lose. They viewed Judge Chen's ruling as injustice rather than correct legal outcome. There would be no reconciliation, no bridge building, no redemption of relationships I'd spent decades hoping might eventually warm. David's business required my full attention in ways I hadn't anticipated during probate and legal battle. I'd been co-owner for years, had managed finances and client relations, but David had handled production, oversight and employee management and technical decisions that now fell to me alone. The company employed 42 people whose livelihoods depended on leadership I wasn't sure I could provide. I was 62 years old, financially secure enough to retire comfortably, tempted to simply sell the business and walk away from responsibilities that felt overwhelming without David's expertise. But something stopped me from taking that easy path, some recognition that the business wasn't just asset to be liquidated, but living legacy of what we'd built together, embodiment of our partnership that deserved better ending than being auctioned to highest bidder. I promoted Marcus Chen, David's production manager for past 8 years, to Chief Operating Officer and gave him significant salary increase and equity stake to secure his loyalty and expertise. Marcus was 41, brilliant with manufacturing processes, deeply respected by the shop floor employees who responded to his quiet competence more readily than they'd ever responded to me. Together we restructured the company to play to our strengths, Marcus handling production and technical decisions, me handling finances and client relations and strategic planning. Both of us working to preserve culture David had cultivated of quality craftsmanship and employee respect and customer service that generated loyalty in industry where those values weren't always prioritized. The company not only survived the transition but grew. We landed 2 major contracts in the first 6 months after David's death, expanded into new product lines Marcus had been researching, increased revenue by 14% year over year, despite losing our founder and facing legal battle that could have destroyed morale. I found unexpected satisfaction in proving I could lead without David, in demonstrating that the business success he'd built hadn't been solely result of his genius, but also product of systems and culture and relationships we'd developed together. Every contract renewal, every satisfied client, every employee who stayed rather than leaving for competitors, they were evidence that our partnership had created something genuine and valuable, something that could outlast even death. But the deeper question that haunted my quiet evenings in-house, that still smelled faintly of David's aftershave, wasn't about business success or legal victories. It was about what all of this had meant, what I'd learned from 3 months of battle against people who'd tried to erase validity of my marriage, what I'd discovered about myself in process of defending life I'd built with man I'd loved. I'd started this fight as a woman who'd spent 62 years being accommodating and pleasant and conflict avoidant, woman who'd made herself smaller to keep others comfortable, woman who'd measured her worth by how little trouble she caused. I emerged as someone different, not harder exactly, but firmer, more certain of my right to occupy space and make demands and refuse to be diminished. Catherine had meant her lawsuit as attack, meant it to frighten me into settlement. meant it to prove that first wives and biological children mattered more than second wives and chosen relationships. But she'd accidentally given me gift of clarity, forced me to articulate why my marriage mattered, pushed me to recognize my own value in ways I'd never quite managed during decades of self-doubt and accommodation. Fighting for David's legacy had taught me to fight for myself. Defending our business had shown me I was capable of leadership I'd never believed possible. Refusing to surrender to intimidation had revealed strength I'd never known I possessed. 6 months after David's death, on what would have been our 29th wedding anniversary, I visited his grave for first time since the funeral. I'd avoided the cemetery during legal battle, unable to face his marker while fighting wars he'd predicted, unable to kneel beside his remains while defending decisions he'd made. But now, with victory secured and business stable, and life beginning to assume new normal shape, I could finally sit on grass beside his headstone and talk to him the way I'd talked to him across kitchen table for 28 years. I told him about the judge's ruling, about Catherine's defeat, about how completely he'd anticipated everything and prepared me for battle I hadn't known was coming. I told him about the business growing despite his absence, about Marcus's promotion, about contracts we'd landed that would have made him proud. I told him about discovering his journal and the locked drawer and the separate legal fund, about reading his final words to me and understanding just how deeply he'd loved me and trusted me and believed in strength I hadn't believed in myself. I told him I missed him with ache that hadn't diminished even slightly, that I'd give back every dollar and every asset and every victory if it meant having him beside me for one more ordinary evening. But I also told him I understood now why he'd structured everything the way he had, why he'd left me the business and the security and the proof that our marriage had been real partnership between equals. He'd known I'd need to fight for it, had known that only by defending what we'd built would I truly understand my own worth, had loved me enough to force me into battle that would transform accommodation into strength. It was gift disguised as burden, test I hadn't wanted but apparently needed, inheritance that included not just assets, but self-discovery. The sun was setting when I finally stood to leave, painting cemetery grounds in gold and amber light that made everything look somehow both beautiful and melancholy. Walking back to my car, I thought about David's daughters and whether they'd ever understand what their father had been trying to teach them through his estate decisions. That real inheritance wasn't money but values, that genuine legacy wasn't assets but character, that love couldn't be measured in dollars but only in commitment and partnership and respect. Probably not. Emma and Sophie and Claire would likely spend the rest of their lives bitter that their father had valued second wife over biological children, never recognizing that he'd actually been teaching them that entitlement doesn't create worth, that receiving doesn't equal deserving, that being someone's child doesn't automatically entitle you to their estate if you haven't honored the relationship while they lived. I drove home through streets now fully familiar again, no longer strange, just a town where I'd built a life with someone I'd loved and now had to figure out how to continue without him. The house was empty when I arrived, would always be empty of the presence that had made it home for 28 years. But it was my house now, in ways it hadn't been, even when we'd shared it, purchased with money I'd helped earn, filled with memories I'd helped create, secured through battles I'd fought and won. David had left me more than assets. He'd left me proof that I was capable of protecting what mattered, defending what I believed in, standing firm when others tried to push me aside. And that, ultimately, was the inheritance that mattered most, the legacy that would sustain me through whatever years remained, the gift that couldn't be stolen by bitter ex-wives or resentful stepchildren or anyone else who tried to diminish the 28 years that had defined my adult life. I'd been David's partner, his equal, his genuine love, and I'd proven it not through claims or assertions, but through actions, through fighting when surrender would have been easier, through standing firm when bending would have required less courage. In the end, I learned that respect isn't demanded, it's earned. But sometimes earning it requires defending yourself against people who will never give it freely, requires proving your worth not to others, but to yourself. requires recognizing that accommodation can become another word for erasure if you're not careful. David had known this about me before I'd known it myself, had loved me enough to create circumstances that would force me to discover my own strength, had trusted me enough to believe I'd rise to challenges I'd spent lifetime avoiding. Have you ever had to fight for something you'd taken for granted? Defend a relationship others tried to dismiss? Prove your worth to yourself more than anyone else? Have you discovered reserves of strength you didn't know existed until circumstance demanded you find them? I'd spent 62 years being one kind of person, pleasant and accommodating and conflict avoidant, and 3 months of legal battle had revealed someone entirely different underneath, someone capable of firmness and determination and refusal to be pushed aside. That transformation was David's final gift to me, the inheritance that mattered more than money or business or legal victories. He'd seen who I could become if circumstances required it, had trusted I'd rise to challenges rather than crumble under them, had loved me enough to ensure I'd have both the resources and the necessity to discover my own strength. And now, sitting in our home surrounded by evidence of the life we'd built together, I understood that the greatest tribute I could give him wasn't grief or loyalty or continued mourning. It was living fully as the strong, capable, unapologetic woman he'd always believed I could be. The woman I'd finally become through battle he'd predicted and prepared me for. The woman who'd defended our love and our legacy and our partnership against everyone who'd tried to diminish them. Catherine had lost more than a lawsuit. She'd lost the opportunity to rewrite history, to make her 18 years with David count for more than my 28, to prove that first families mattered more than chosen ones. David's daughters had lost too, though they'd probably never recognize it. They'd lost the chance to honor their father's actual values instead of just claiming his assets, to demonstrate they'd learned anything from the generous, difficult man who'd raised them, to prove themselves worthy of the love he'd given them even when they'd given him so little in return. But I'd won everything that truly mattered. Validation that my marriage had been real and valuable, confirmation that partnership means more than biology, proof that love isn't measured by how long you knew someone, but by how genuinely you honored them while you had them. And I discovered that 62 wasn't too old to transform, that accommodation wasn't the only possible response to conflict, that sometimes the kindest thing you can do for yourself is refuse to be kind to people trying to destroy you. The business David and I built together continues thriving. The home we shared remains my sanctuary. The life we created endures despite his absence. Not because I'm living in the past, but because I'm honoring the partnership by moving forward as the strong, capable, fully realized woman he always knew I could become. That's the real inheritance, the genuine legacy, the true victory that no lawsuit could ever threaten and no hostile family could ever diminish. And that understanding that the greatest gift someone can give you is seeing your potential before you see it yourself, believing